Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In Surah Taha, verse 5, Allah says, Ar-Rahmanu alal arsh istawa. And the translation of this verse is, the most merciful is above the throne established. Now, have you ever felt that you have committed so many sins in your life that there is no way Allah can forgive you? When you change your company and you start to sit with more righteous and more pious people, do you start to feel as if you are not worthy of sitting in the company of such people? Does your mind start telling you that these people are so good and they're so religious, how can you possibly be sitting with them? If they were to ever find out what kind of sins you have committed, they would never like to associate themselves with you. Did you possibly think that by just doing tawbah and changing yourself, you can become like these people who have probably never done anything bad in their lives? If you have these kinds of thoughts, then it just proves that you are definitely on the path of Islam, because these are nothing but the waswasa of Iblis. As I mentioned previously, Iblis is waiting for us on the path of right, which means the minute he notices that we have started to do tawbah, we have started to try and pray, we are down in sajda crying for forgiveness, that is when Iblis becomes active. So imagine for 1 second that you have lived a life of sin. You have done things that you are ashamed to speak of, and eventually you start to feel that guilt is piling up inside of you. Guilt, by the way, is part of your fitrah. It is the alarm system that goes off inside of you, warning you that you're doing something wrong, and it just doesn't feel morally right. It is actually a gift from Allah. So imagine that after sinning repeatedly in your life and initially ignoring the guilt that you felt along the way, suddenly the guilt piles up so much that you just cannot ignore it anymore. You feel uneasy, uncomfortable, you feel terrible about yourself. You start to cry for no reason, you feel down and depressed and very empty on the inside. And then someone comes along and tells you that, listen, Allah is Ar-Rahman, He can forgive everything. So suddenly you have hope. You try and do sajda, you pray for the first time, you beg for Allah's mercy. And as you're doing this, you start to feel better. The guilt goes down. You start having hope that Allah will forgive you. It's not too late. You start studying the Quran, you do more prayers, and eventually and slowly you change your lifestyle. Now at this moment, Iblis realizes that he needs to do something. He cannot tell you to stop praying because that will never work. You are feeling better about yourself after praying, so why would you stop? So instead, he understands he has to give you a different kind of waswasa. So what he does is, he reminds you of all the sins you've committed, how huge they were, so that the guilt starts to increase again. Then when you sit with good company and you're enjoying that good company, he comes along and he whispers negative thoughts, telling you that you are so sinful. How can you even sit with these nice and pious people? He tells you that, listen, you are not deserving of their company. And eventually the guilt peaks. You start believing what Iblis tells you. You start thinking, why would Allah forgive me? My sins are just too huge to be forgiven. How can I sit with these pious people? I can never be like them. So during those moments, remind yourself of this simple verse. Of all the creations that Allah has made, the biggest of His creation is His throne, because His throne is on top of everything. His throne covers everything. So of all the planets, of all the universes, Allah's throne is above all of them. It covers all of them. That's why it is Allah's biggest creation. But then the verse tells us that Allah is upon the throne. So God must be bigger than His biggest creation. So imagine for a second now how huge, how grand Allah is. He is bigger than anything we can imagine. But note that Allah does not say Allah is upon the throne. It says Ar-Rahman. Now Allah has many names. He could have used any other name, or he could have just said Allah. But why choose Ar-Rahman? Because Allah is giving you a message. He wants you to know that His mercy, His rahmat is so vast, it's so big, it's so grand that it's bigger than His biggest creation. Which means if the throne covers everything and Rahman covers the throne, then there can be nothing greater than that. So how can you possibly think that your tiny sins are too big for Rahman to forgive? How can you possibly think that Allah cannot erase all of your past sins, no matter how huge, or that He can convert all the past sins into good deeds? Never allow your guilt to become so extreme that you underestimate the power of Allah's rahmat. Underestimating Allah's rahmat is a greater sin than all your sins combined. It's never too late to change. It's never too late to become a pious person who is loved by God. And most importantly, don't forget that for someone who has lived a life of sin, to suddenly change his path and become a good Muslim is so much more difficult than for someone who has always been raised as a pious Muslim and has always done good. The challenge is greater, the jihad is greater for someone who experienced many sins and now wants to change. And Allah knows this. So while you think that you are not pious enough to sit with the pious, what you don't realize is that your jihad is so much greater that at that moment you are more pious than anyone else. Assalamu alaikum.